Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for your time today. We welcome you to San Jose and to our risk management seminar, as Mac said, put on by us here at 501c Agencies Trust. As Mac already mentioned, my name is Ben, last name Jonas. I'm a trust representative with 501 and a licensed insurance broker here in the state of California and a few other states across the country. My experience with the nonprofit sector comes from insurance underwriting as well as insurance brokering. I specialize in 501c3 nonprofits and was grateful for the opportunity to work here at 501c Agencies Trust and continue to serve the sector. 501 has an interesting story, a wonderful story, started by an executive of a UCP here in Los Altos. He discovered that in the late 1970s, early 80s, there was a law on the books that afforded 501c3 nonprofits to opt out of the state unemployment insurance tax and take on the risk themselves. He left his work as an executive at a UCP to educate the 501c3 sector about the opportunities that are available to them and to help manage the risk. We've been doing it for over 30 years, thanks to his vision. And today we're going to be talking about a couple different topics. Risk profile is where we're going to start. We're going to talk about risk profile, which is a complex subject, obviously, in the context of underwriting narratives and how a risk profile can help your 501c3 nonprofit negotiate for better terms, secure insurance, and reduce your overall insurance costs. We're also going to talk about catastrophic losses in workers' compensation and auto liability, and we're going to finish with a new Assembly Bill 2883 that impacts workers' compensation here in California. I understand a lot of folks are coming to us from all over the country. The state of California oftentimes is a bellwether state for law that may come up in your state, so we do feel it's valuable for everyone across the country to get an idea of some of the legislature that's been passed with regards to workers' compensation. But we're going to start with risk profile. So according to Investopedia, a risk profile is an evaluation of an individual's or organization's willingness to take risks as well as the threats to which an organization is exposed. As I mentioned, these are sophisticated, complex assessments that are put together that are specific to an organization that effectively outline a philosophy or a story for how your organization is going to face risk. It's a blueprint or a map for how your nonprofit is going to deal with uncertainty. We aren't going to go into creating an entire risk profile. Each profile for every organization is going to be different. The level of complexity, the level of sophistication is going to mirror the complexity of sophistication of the organization. But what I want to talk to you today about is how you can use a risk profile to negotiate for better terms in insurance, to reduce your costs, and even to get claims covered that may not otherwise be covered under your policy. But I thought I'd start with a question for the folks in the room. Anybody here have experience working with a risk profile or creating a risk profile for their organization at all? No, that's okay. Anybody have experience with working with a risk profile even in the for-profit sector or in another? No, not at all. Okay, no problem. A risk profile is the product of an assessment. So your organization is going to be taking a look at its legal exposure, its operational exposure, its strategies going forward and how it wants to meet its mission. And from that assessment, you are going to get, as I said, a philosophy or an idea of how your nonprofit is going to deal with, manage, and treat uncertainty as it comes up. There's some key considerations when defining a risk profile for your organization, the first of which is capacity. We think of these issues oftentimes in the world of personal investments or personal finances, right? For capacity, it really is about the level of financial risk your organization is able and willing to manage. In the personal side, think of Jeff Bezos or a Warren Buffett, right, who has an extraordinary personal wealth, and their capacity for financial risk is much higher than the rest of us. Organizationally, think of a Goodwill versus a CASA, right, or a Goodwill versus a performing arts group, right? Those two different organizations are going to have a much different capacity to handle and manage risk. Risk requirements is another important consideration. Those are the absolute, the risk that your organization will have to face in order to meet its mission. For example, I work here in San Jose and I live in Santa Cruz, but if I'm going to work here in San Jose, I'm going to have to drive over Highway 17. There's just no other way to avoid it, right? So risk requirements are these unavoidable risks that we have to take on as a way of meeting our mission. It's essential, this part of identifying risk requirements is such an important part for any nonprofit organization because it's going to give you an idea of what risks you're going to have to face. And at the very bottom level, it will identify what coverages from an insurance standpoint you're going to have to consider, right? Take, for example, an organization that provides one-on-one counseling to folks under the age of 18, right? If one-on-one closed-door meetings, let's say with at-risk kids, you're facing exposures with regards to, as sad it is to say, improper sexual conduct. There may be professional liability in addition to the general liability exposures that an organization may face. So you want to identify these requirements as early as possible and be sure that you're managing them appropriately. Finally, risk tolerance. That is actually an emotional or psychological part of this process. It's what you as an individual, or in the case of a nonprofit organization, what the board of directors and the executives are willing to take on. Consider, for example, flying, okay? Some people are afraid of flying and they're just not willing to do it, even though it's one of the safest forms of travel known to man, right? That same person may be willing to drive 8 hours to get to their destination, but they just won't tolerate the risk of the plane blowing up in the sky, right? That's an emotional perspective. In the world of a nonprofit organization, the risk tolerance may be a matter of visibility, right? The board of directors might not be willing to take on certain operations because it's going to make them visible in the community, right? Other attitudes of tolerance are who your organization is going to serve potentially. Another important part of identifying risk tolerance is, and I spoke a little bit about it already, but is the difference between subjective and objective risk. Seeing how something is actually versus how you feel about it. Identifying risk tolerance is such an important part of any risk profile, and it needs to be ascertained through conversation, right? This is something you talk about with your board of directors about their comfort level. It's something you talk about with executives and what they're comfortable participating in. It's also a conversation for rank and file employees about what they're comfortable taking on. These considerations are the backbone of any valuable risk profile. But I also want to talk about what a risk profile is not. It isn't the assessment, and sometimes there's some confusion there. And folks sometimes think that by performing an assessment or the assessment itself is the profile, and these are different things, right? The assessment is the questions that you're asking about your compliance, about your legal structure, about your operation and about your strategy. And it's from those questions that you're going to get this identity, right, of how you manage uncertainty. Why is this valuable? We've spoken a little bit generally about what a risk profile is, but how it can benefit your organization is in the form of what I call underwriting narratives. And underwriting narratives are in addition to your application for insurance. So I'm sure most or everyone is familiar with applications of insurance, or for the folks here in the room, has anybody heard of accord forms? Through a raise of hands? No, accord forms? Accord forms are the standard insurance documents that underwriters use to gain rating information and specific info about a risk when going forward with the underwriting process. There's more to that. There's a story that can be told. And if your organization is willing to commit to developing a risk profile, to identifying a story or a map by which you navigate insurance, you can communicate that to the insurance underwriter through your broker. And that can be hugely valuable for a couple reasons. And I'll give you some examples from my experience of how underwriting narratives have really kind of moved the ball. The first of which is by articulating your risk profile in the context of an insurance application, you may be able to bring your costs down. And I'll give you an example. I was working as an underwriter at an organization that worked exclusively with 501c3 nonprofits, and an account came across my desk that had some rather severe sexual harassment claims that were made alleged against the board, one of the members of the board. And it was all over the papers. And, yeah, and so we'll talk a little bit about public relations exposure, I promise. But this application came across my desk, and insurance of application, or excuse me, the application of insurance was there, the accord information I needed, but in addition to that information, the broker wrote me 3 or 4 paragraphs outlining what had happened in the past, what the organization had done today to address those issues, and what the organization was expecting, or what the organization expected from a law standpoint going forward. And they helped me understand that the person that was alleged of sexual harassment was no longer there at the organization, and that they had moved on, that there was a new team of executives that had taken over the nonprofit, and they had incredible experience in both human resources and employment practices. So they were tuned in to the changes that needed to be made at that organization to ensure that there weren't any further sexual harassment claims brought against the nonprofit. If it was just the insurance of application, or if it was just the accord forms and all that bare minimum, as an underwriter, I would have taken a pass. I would have done my own research and found online the articles that had been written, the complaints that had been lodged, and would have, from that information, made my decision. I'm not going to underwrite this, right? I'm not going to take this bet on. Because when we're talking about insurance, we're talking about bets that are made by people, right? But thanks to the story that was told, the narrative that was shared with the broker, I was willing to take this to my underwriting manager and say, you know what, this is a good bet. I understand that their history is, spotty, but there's real reason here for us to consider this organization as a good bet, and let's give them competitive pricing, right? Let's not gouge them, but let's give them reasonable pricing and develop a relationship going forward. I want to identify some specifics that you guys can use in communication with your broker that can make effective underwriting statements or underwriting narratives. It's essential that you discuss the mission of your nonprofit and its impact in your community or in the nation, right? You want the underwriter and the insurance company to connect with what you do with the people that you serve, okay? It's okay to make an appeal to emotion. It really is. Furthermore, you want to own prior losses, right? So sometimes we get folks who say, if the underwriter discovers what happened, good for them, but we're not going to, we don't need to share that with them. And I would advocate an alternative position. Take ownership of those losses and present them to your broker and to the insurance company and say, we know what happened. We can demonstrate to you how we fixed the problem and why it's not going to happen again, especially in the world of catastrophic losses that end up in the paper, right? Those are things that might be missed, but probably not going to be missed. And if anything, you're doing yourself a disservice by trying to shy away from it. I think that if your organization can proactively take ownership of those losses, you're going to have a better time getting insurance where maybe you otherwise weren't able to, but also in controlling costs, right? You have these serious claims that come up and we see these spikes in insurance costs, right? You can work around that. You can talk with your broker, you can talk with the insurer and demonstrate how you're going to be moving forward and why a relationship is still valuable and the costs, they're still going to make money over the long term, right? These underwriting narratives, they really need to be persuasive. And it's okay to implement a little rhetoric now and again, right? I came, I saw, I did it safely. It maybe can be an effective way of communicating what your organization is planning to do moving forward. And keep in mind, underwriters are people, okay? And I think that gets lost in the current age or most people's current understanding of how insurance works. I think that when people think insurance, they're thinking Geico, they're thinking Progressive, they're thinking State Farm. You go online, you enter in a few pieces of information, and out pops your number of how much it's going to cost to insure your car, Commercial insurance is far more complex, right? There are a lot of moving parts. It cannot be exclusively underwritten by a computer. A human being has to make that determination whether or not the risk that's coming across their desk is one that's going to be insurable or not. Their mood in that given moment is a factor, right? Their attitude about what you do on a personal level is going to be a factor. And it's so important to keep that in mind as you seek out insurance, because you can communicate with these people on their level. And in doing so, you'll be able to secure costs. You'll be able to secure insurance at a lower cost. And I do think that you'll be able to secure insurance where otherwise you wouldn't get it. Another example that I like to share was an account that came across my desk for an at-risk kids camp that was out in the middle of nowhere. So this organization was helping at-risk youths between the ages of 10 and 18 years old who had really troubled backgrounds, really difficult kids to manage, and they were running a summer camp out in the middle of nowhere. And one of the things that made it so difficult to insure this organization was that a part of the counseling that was going on was one-on-one, and it was behind closed doors. And when we're talking about youths and adults mixing in that way, there's real exposure, especially for kids who have had, a troubled background. An underwriting narrative is such an important part of my decision of deciding to insure that organization. The broker had incredible experience working with other organizations that performed similar operations. He was able to share with me his specific loss control techniques that he implemented with his other nonprofits that were effective at controlling risk, like liability, like professional liability, improper sexual conduct, among others. And it was critical, specific pieces of information that he was sharing with me that I was then able to take to my management and say, in addition to the square footage of the building and how many kids that they have and all the rooms that are available, there is a story here that makes it clear that this is a good bet for us. Okay, so I think that there's real value in understanding that you're dealing with people, that telling a story is compelling. Before I move on to catastrophic losses, any questions on that issue? Any need for clarification there at all? No. There's one other story that I want to share having to do with a property location in Washington State. Came across my desk, bare minimum. This was the exact opposite. It was just rating information in the insurance of applications. Square footage, when the building was built, updates hadn't happened in 20 years or so, very minimal. So I was doing my due diligence as an underwriter and getting online. I'm on Google, I want to see pictures of the building. Where is it located? What protection class is it in? Protection class is a way for underwriters to determine what kind of access a location will have to fire services. Very little information, but when I did my research, I was able to see that there were trees that were growing up and around the building. The building looked like it was dilapidated and in dire need of maintenance and service. And I declined coverage. And I went back to the broker and was like, I understand that this nonprofit is one that we insure already, but this property risk is not one that I'm going to consider. And they were disappointed and they were frustrated. And I can say, as someone who's worked in the industry, if that broker would have picked up the phone or had written me an email saying, Ben, you'll see that there are trees coming up against the building and that it's in need of updates. This is how we plan on managing this. We're going to be dealing with the trees by, in this fashion. We're going to make these specific updates. The organization uses this space to treat the constituents in this way and has owned the space for 15 years without any losses. Let me tell you a story about why this is a good bet for you, okay? Catastrophic losses in auto liability and workers' comp. This is not necessarily new information, but it's worth talking about because it continues to be a place of extreme, severe losses, and they're far too frequent. So what we're going to do is we're going to look through some claims and how they've impacted auto liability and workers' comp simultaneously and explore the connection there, okay? This is a quote from Jen Rhee. Jen Rhee is a prominent reinsurer, and I found this in an article, and there will be a reference page that I'll share with everyone so that you can get an idea of the references that I was using in preparation for this. But they pointed out this, what I believe is in a very important point, that motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of worker death and have historically been the #1 contributor to workplace catastrophic injuries, okay? So it's not lifting, right? It's not carpal tunnel. You know, what's really going on here is that folks are traveling to and from business meetings, right? They're carpooling, they're ride sharing, and they're distracted drivers in a lot of instances. Very simple stuff, but resulting in huge problems for nonprofits nationwide. So we've changed the names of people here and of organizations to protect the innocent. It's very much like Law and Order. But this did happen, as shocking as it may be. So an individual was working on behalf of his nonprofit. He was driving a company car, so we're talking about commercial auto. He made the decision en route to his meeting to pull over and pick up, no less than 3 hitchhikers into his car. He pulled off on the side of the road. 3 people entered his car who he'd never met before. And pulling onto the roadway was at fault in a very serious collision. He was seriously hurt. The 3 people that he picked up were seriously hurt, and the person coming down the road suffered a catastrophic injury, okay? This was a huge problem for this nonprofit organization. Their cost for auto liability skyrocketed, right? The 3 individuals, and keep in mind, and I'm not an attorney, but we're talking about 4 personal injury claims here, right? The 3 people in the car and the driver of the second vehicle that are all going to look to the nonprofit's insurance policy for indemnity. Further, auto liability skyrocketed. Their workers' comp, because the driver was injured in the course of his work for the nonprofit, was out of work for quite some time. And this proved to be a huge problem. This was one example that really kind of blew me away. One, because I think it identifies the importance of having a discussion with rank and file employees about what may seem to be common sense, right? I think a lot of people would say, like, what are you doing? You know, why are you pulling over to the side of the road and picking up 3 people when you're on your way to a meeting? But it still needs to be a conversation that's had, because people make choices that sometimes we as executives really wouldn't ever okay. Another example is pulling over to the side of the road to help another driver, right? I see that quite a bit, where folks see that someone else is in need of help on a highway, like Highway 5, and they decide that they're going to pull over to the side of the road and help that person out. If they're driving on behalf of an organization, the nonprofit is going to face huge exposure as a result of that kind of behavior. And it's worth having a conversation. It may be something as simple as, like, don't pick up hitchhikers. But maybe not as simple as, I understand that maybe you're inclined to stop and help people on the side of the road. When you're working on behalf of the nonprofit, it's important you just call the police when you get to your destination, right? The previous example was really about commercial auto, but I want to also talk about Nonno. Are folks familiar with Nonno from a coverage standpoint? Is that something that people see about a little bit? Okay, not at all? Okay, good. My concern was everyone was going to raise their hand and be like, I know all about this, and you're wasting my time. But Nonno continues to be a serious exposure for 501c3 nonprofits. And what that means is that I am driving my personal vehicle on behalf of the nonprofit for the benefit of the organization, right? I'm driving my truck to go pick stuff up for the food bank, and I'm going to bring it back to the food bank, okay? This is an example of an incident that occurred, again, just very sad, and you know, I think it asked the question about decision making, but what ended up happening was we had an employee who was at fault in a catastrophic collision, driving their car on behalf of the nonprofit. The person was driving their car, they were emailing their boss about what they were doing, right? So they're trying to do their job, and this happens, distracted driving continues to be a huge problem. But this person was like, yeah, I picked it up and I'm coming back and everything's good, and then smash. She was also uninsured at the time. So she's driving on behalf of the nonprofit, and the nonprofit organization had no idea that she currently did not have personal auto insurance. Does anybody here know how their organization, if at all, identifies personal auto insurance on behalf of the men and women that are driving for their nonprofit? You do? Yes? Would you be willing to share how your organization manages that?
Yeah, anyone who's going to drive either one of our vans or one of our vehicles or their own vehicle has to be cleared through the insurance. I get this one task. I get to keep their driver's license and their insurance. And I have to have a copy, and then I have to go every 4 months and ask them for another one because they expire.
Yeah, sure.
So we have to have it on file at all times.
And may I ask, do you look at limits of insurance? Do you set a requirement?
Yeah. I don't remember what they are, but they're pretty high.
Okay. Sorry, your name is?
Stephanie.
Stephanie. Okay, so everyone at home, what Stephanie was sharing is that every 4 months she has to review the personal auto insurance as well as the driver's licenses for all the drivers that are driving, and if I got this right, either their car or a company car. And you do identify limits of insurance for those individuals. Okay, great. That's great to hear, and it's an essential way of controlling this risk, right? We want to be sure that, one, they're insured, but it's also to consider the limits of insurance, right? Here in California, I believe the limits are $1530, and that's not going to be sufficient if you kill somebody. As a personal injury attorney, a friend of mine once said, it really is my job to find the deepest pockets. And so, please, yeah, Paul?
Is it common for the employer to ask to be put on as an additional insured to get notifications should they not make their payment or like it gets canceled?
Yeah. Yeah, the question was, is it common for nonprofits to be named as additional insured on auto liability policies? I don't believe it is. To my knowledge, it is not common. What Stephanie pointed out is the most effective treatment that we have seen of managing auto liability insurance. The other effective is securing what's known as non-owned coverage, right? And that's the coverage that would have come into play here in this incident. It's a secondary coverage. If the limits of insurance of the person driving their own auto, right? I'm driving my own auto, I get into a horrible wreck, and I only have 1530 limits, they're insufficient. The non-owned auto coverage of the nonprofit would jump in to contemplate the remaining exposure.
What's 1530?
1530, thank you, Sonia. 1530 reflects the limits of insurance stayed out by the state of California, so $15,000, $30,000. In this instance, the limits of insurance were exhausted. The claim was $1 million to pay for the claimant's injuries, to care for them for their lifetime. Yeah, really sad. And the driver was injured severely, and so this organization's workers' comp claims skyrocketed, their XMOD skyrocketed, their costs claimed, or their costs climbed. I got it. And so too did their auto liability costs, okay? So there's a connection here that needs to be acknowledged and controlled. I want to talk about PR risk, okay? Because these types of catastrophic incidents really do impact public relations because they end up in the paper, okay? And I'm wondering, for the folks here, do you think that your board of directors is prepared to talk with the media about a catastrophic loss? Raise of hands if it's a yes. One. Raise a hand if it's a no. Okay, for all of the, I'd be interested to know what the folks around the country feel about that as well. You may, be willing to email Mac with your perspective on that. I'd really appreciate it. Has anybody missed what happened on United Airlines lately? No. Okay, so I wanted to bring this up because even at the highest level, there still continues to be a failure from a public relations standpoint. And in the nonprofit world, because we have boards of directors and a variety of officers that are all interacting with the community, it's essential that a conversation is had with everyone to get everyone on the same page as to what's going to happen, what's going to be said, if anything, about a certain incident, right? As we take a look at the incidents in the past, both of those were in the paper, right? Local news reporters are saying, we had someone who's an employee of a prominent nonprofit organization pull over to the side of the road and pick up 3 hitchhikers and they get into a horrible wreck, right? Your organization is going to have to be prepared to address concerns of funders, grant makers, right? The community at large. You're going to have to address those issues, and you want to do so proactively by having a conversation. What about management staff instead of the board? Do you think that the executives of your nonprofit are prepared to have a tough conversation with media or the members of the community? Can I get a show of hands of yes? Okay, a bit more. All right. Show of hands of no. One. Okay. Questions about catastrophic loss, how to manage them, how do they impact your nonprofit organization? Okay. I'm getting there. Final part of this presentation addresses Assembly Bill 2883. In the state of California has just thrown a curveball into the mix. I wanted to start this section by just a show of hands of folks in the room. Are folks aware of Assembly Bill 2883? Show of hands, yes? A little bit, Paul? Okay. Okay. This is a complicated matter, but 501c3 agencies trust is committed to educating the sector. We want to be sure that we're bringing relevant information that is valuable to both our prospects and our members. And this was passed in November of last year. It's Assembly Bill 2883, and it impacts how directors and officers are covered by workers' compensation. So in the past, officers and directors were not required to be covered under workers' compensation, right? They could be excluded on the policy. They were unpaid volunteers, no problem. As a result of Associate Bill 2883 being passed, the state of California has effectively narrowed the definition of an employee that can be excluded from a workers' comp policy. Officers and directors now may be required, if they want to be excluded from workers' comp, they have to complete a waiver. Okay, and I want everyone to go to their broker and ask about this issue and how your nonprofit is currently handling it. I'm talking about, members of the board as well as the officers now would have to sign a waiver to submit to their insurer saying, one, that we want to be excluded from workers' comp, and it's acceptable for us to be excluded because we own at least 15% of issued and outstanding stock. For 501c3 nonprofits, I don't know how you do that because there is no issued stock. So the concern among insurance professionals and attorneys is that workers' comp costs for nonprofits are going to be hit because they're going to have to pay for their directors and their officers to be covered because they won't be able to be excluded, right? They can't own any stock. I wanted to read this this is from the state. This new definition states that officers and directors can only opt out of coverage by completing a waiver of penalty and perjury and filing the waiver with the nonprofit's insurer. The minimum maximum rule is the final tidbit that I wanted to bring to your attention, to address this with your broker to be sure that your organization is in compliance with this and not going to be hit with penalties. It will typically come up in audit as insurers are looking at who should and shouldn't be covered by your workers' comp policy. But I'm out of time. Questions?
I mean, unless they own any stock, they will be required to.
Yes, if they don't own any stock, they will, to my understanding, based on my reading of the bill, they'll have to be covered under workers' comp. Thank you, everyone, for your time. No questions? Concerns? Quandaries? Okay. That's it. Thank you.